This is apropos. Unprecedented and unlawful. It's the latest twist in the AI firm's high-stakes battle with the US military over usage restrictions on its technology. Anthropic has begun legal proceedings aimed at blocking the Pentagon from placing it on a national security blacklist after the startup refused to remove guardrails against using its AI for autonomous weapons and domestic surveillance. Monty Francis has the details.
The Pentagon has refused to say whether artificial intelligence was used to mistakenly target a school in Iran near a naval base, resulting in the deaths of 175 people, mostly children. But the Wall Street Journal first reported that the U.S. military was indeed using AI for a range of purposes, including to identify targets for Operation Epic Fury. Last week, the Defense Department said it was cutting ties with its tech of choice, Anthropic's Claude, after the company's CEO, Dario Amodei, demanded that the government put up some guardrails for how the tech was being used, including assurances that it would not be used to power autonomous weapons or for mass surveillance at home.
I'm concerned about the autonomous behavior of AI models, their potential for misuse by individuals and governments, and their potential for economic displacement.
In response, the Pentagon argued it was not up to a private company to determine how the tech could be used on the battlefield. And Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth went a step further, announcing that he was labeling Anthropic a supply chain risk, prompting the company to file 2 lawsuits against the government on Monday, arguing the designation violated its free speech and due process rights. The company said it would not be swayed by intimidation or punishment, adding, Anthropic's reputation and core First Amendment freedoms are under attack. Last Friday, President Trump said he was ordering federal agencies to stop using Anthropic's tech, allowing them 6 months to phase it out. But there are reports that Amodei is still in talks with the Pentagon to possibly hash out a deal. Sam Altman, the CEO of the Microsoft-backed OpenAI, has since announced a deal with the Defense Department to provide technology on the government's classified systems.
Well, Donald Trump says the executive order formally instructing the federal government to remove Anthropic's AI from its operations will likely be issued later this week. Well, for more, let's bring in Elke Schwarz, Professor of Political Theory at Queen Mary University of London. Thanks so much for being with us on the programme. Now, you've written about this feud, saying that it's unusual in that it pits state might against corporate power. Where exactly did this dispute begin?
Well, the dispute itself seemed to have been brewing over the course of at least a year. I mean, I'm not privy to all the communications that were going on behind the scenes, but there was a kind of a uneasy relationship between certain individuals, between the Pentagon and certain individuals and Anthropic, allegedly. Now, we have to understand that Anthropic has a contract, of course, with the Department of Defense, or Department of War, as it is now often referred to, since July 2025. But Anthropic also has entered into a partnership or into a contractual relationship with Palantir, and Palantir provides Maven Smart Systems, which the US Department of Defense uses for AI targeting and AI decision support systems. And that contract was entered in 2024, I believe. So the relationship has a longer history, and it was only in recent months that this relationship seemed to have turned. And it is likely that this has to do with the fact that the Department of Defense, Department of War, has issued an AI strategy for the military domain. And in this strategy, the Department of Defense has clarified specifically what it understands to be responsible AI in the military domain. And there are certain broader, let's say, interpretations of AI and its lawfulness than was previously the case. So the Department of Defense expects to be able to use any AI model or product for any lawful use. That's the stipulation. But that is, of course, open to interpretation. And I think this is where Anthropic was a little bit uncomfortable, because it wanted to set these 2 red lines, it doesn't want its models to be used for mass surveillance of US citizens or for fully autonomous weapons systems. So that's the foundation of this dispute, with a lot of back and forth, but really it focuses the attention very much onto the US and its stipulations, and kind of shifts much more stringent ethical and legal concerns in the use of AI, specifically the use of large language models for military purposes, into the margins, and I think that's somewhat problematic.
Yeah, because as we heard in that report, it suggested that this technology was used not only in Venezuela, but also during the ongoing conflict, the attacks on Iran. What does this tell us, Elke, in your view, this whole dispute about how artificial intelligence is likely to be used, if it's not already being used, in warfare?
Well, artificial intelligence in warfare has been used for quite a while, actually. For those of us who have worked in this kind of environment for the last decade, we have seen the accelerated integration of various AI tools and AI models into the military domain, and that is fine. And so when we talk about artificial intelligence, we must remember we're not simply talking about large language models, although that dominates the current consciousness and imagination about what AI is constituted of. But AI can be many, many things in the military domain. They can be quite narrow models that help organize supply chains or make logistics more efficient or help with translations. So kind of narrow applications of artificial intelligence that are quite different to those general purpose large language models that Anthropic's Claude is, for example, or various other companies offer these large language model products. So we've seen an increasing integration or increased integration of artificial intelligence into the military domain at large, but also into the decision-making cycle and specifically the targeting cycle. Again, not only or not primarily general AI type technologies, but more specific type of object recognition systems, for example. So bringing in these large language models tells us something about the much broader, much more expanded and much more sped and scaled up integration of AI into all aspects of military operations. And where this, of course, causes the greatest challenges is in the targeting cycle. Because what we're now seeing is quite a radical acceleration in terms of how quickly targets are identified or indeed discovered, and then how quickly targets then get actioned. We've heard reports in the context of Iran with 1,000 targets in the first 24 hours. That's a lot of targets. That raises a number of questions. One question is, where is human oversight, right? So human judgment is still required in order to make sure that these targets that are being attacked are ultimately valid targets, that they are not civilian targets accidentally, that the data and information on which these target decisions rest is sound, and again, to protect civilian populations and civilian objects and civilian infrastructures, there's a mandate to take precaution in the targeting process. Now, that's really, really difficult when you're dealing with 41 targets an hour or 1,000 targets in a 24-hour period. So that's a challenge that we're seeing with this sped up, so more speed, broader scale of targeting that becomes possible with artificial intelligence, and specifically with large language models. And I think this was potentially Anthropic's point as well. There's not sufficient reliability at this stage. Some of these large language models have a 25 to 50% reliability, which means they're wrong very often, or they put things together that don't necessarily make sense because these models can't understand meaning, or they don't really have an understanding like we do. So with all of these new tools in the mix, that shifts the temporal horizons, that shifts the scale of possible action, and that, of course, challenges accountability, responsibility, and human judgment.
And once such a rapidly evolving technology, as you point out there, once it's actually out there, what can these AI firms do to prevent their technology being used or adapted, particularly when it's being used in classified military systems, when they don't actually know how exactly the technology is going to be implemented? What can they do about that?
Well, it depends on the type of technology that we're talking about. Very often, it's that there are ways to potentially safeguard misuse, large-scale misuse through various restrictions. But normally, technology firms or weapons firms or military suppliers do work with the government to ensure that a weapon system or any kind of system that is used for military operations is reliable, adheres to various legal reviews, adheres to international humanitarian law and the broader stipulations for ethics of war. So what we're seeing here at the moment is really a broadening out of actually dual use type technologies coming into the military sector. Dual use means there's very often technologies that were designed and invented and used and rolled out first for the civilian sector and now find their purpose within a military environment. And very often the safeguards, regulations, and the same stipulations for testing, evaluating, verifying, validating, all these robust processes that have to be in place for military technologies are not necessarily in place for those new types of digital technologies. And so it is an interesting inversion in this Anthropic Pentagon case in that it should normally be the government, the democratically elected government, that puts guardrails, restrictions, safeguards onto the private sector and its interests in order to ensure that, that citizens don't come to harm or that the interests of the citizens are safeguarded. In this instance, we seem to have an inversion, but I would venture to say there aren't really any good guys, because we have now seen quite quickly how the ethical bar and legal bar has been lowered quite significantly to stipulations about mass surveillance and fully autonomous weapon systems, when really the use of artificial intelligence in targeting poses a much greater risk and challenge, especially always to civilians, because of potential errors and false information and false suggestions towards the human. So as I see it right now, it doesn't strike me as though Anthropic is necessarily wanting to cut ties with the government or put safeguards onto its products. It should be the role of a government or the international community to find much more robust rules and regulations than we have right now, or than we're seeing in this dispute, to say, this is what AI is good for, and here's what we will use it for. And this is where significant risks reside to accountability, human judgment, and therefore also risks towards risks for civilians in conflict.
Elke Schwarz, thanks so much for being with us on the programme this evening. That's Elke Schwarz, Professor of Political Theory at Queen Mary University, London.